Hey, besties, and welcome back to the Your Two Best Friends podcast with your co-hosts, Annalise and myself, Danielle Hanlon. So today we just want to talk about this concept of a legacy that your life leaves behind. And that everyone leaves a legacy, but not everyone leaves a good legacy or a legacy that was what they wanted to leave. And so this past weekend, my husband's grandfather passed, Grandpa George, and he was a wonderful man. And I have been married to my husband for 3 years. I've been together with him for 5. So I've just known him for the last 5 years. But my husband has told me lots and lots of stories about his Grandpa George and fond memories growing up with him and getting to hunt together and things like that. We play a lot of cribbage in our house, and that is thanks to his Grandpa George. So some of you may have been recipients of Connor and I's love for cribbage, and that is also thanks to him. So you may have been influenced by Grandpa George as well. But when we were at his funeral together with his family, I was really just floored. I knew Grandpa George, and he was a great man, always cracking jokes, like I said, a real joy to be around, a faithful husband, and a really good dad. But I think at people's funeral, you really get to see the impact that they've had on the people around them in their life and the legacy that they've left behind. Grandpa George was actually my husband's step-grandfather. He wasn't his biological grandfather. His biological grandfather had left when my father-in-law was in his late teens, and he had 2 older sisters when they were in their young 20s. And he had some mental health issues and things. And so they didn't really grow up with a stable father, even when they had one. And so that was definitely a void in their life, and my husband's dad and his 2 aunts. And so Grandpa George was actually saved later in life, and he had been married multiple times before he married my husband's grandma. And he says that he was at a bar one day drinking, and he heard the Lord audibly say to him, "George, this is your last chance." And he got up and left the bar and started following Jesus the rest of his life. And that is the craziest testimony I've ever heard, but so powerful. I mean, after that, he was married to my husband's grandma for 35 years. Even after we married to multiple people for shorter times, had a wonderful marriage to my husband's grandmother, grandmother, and was a really good dad to his new stepkids. And so you think about my father-in-law, my husband's father, and he was in his late teens, a time you really need a dad. I mean, for boys in their teens, you really are looking for that father figure in your life. And so that's something that Ron had really been wanting. And George came in to 3 kids he didn't he didn't help create. He didn't have to be a dad to. And all 3 of them call him their dad. He stepped up and was a dad to all 3 of them. And then we're at the funeral hearing Connor's uncle, so the man who married his aunt, also talk about how he lost his father when he was 11 and how George was his father. And then his other aunt married a man who also had lost his dad when he was 9 or 10, who George was like his father. And then I look over, and he had a daughter from one of the previous marriages, not biological, but who claimed him as her dad. And so I'm all of a sudden looking around at 6 people who saw this man as their father. No biological children in this world, but he stepped up and was their dad. And then a wife who he was faithfully married to, and was just, I was just thinking, like, wow, this man got saved and then totally changed the lives of so many people that needed a dad, that he was a faithful dad for, that all follow the Lord now. And then you look at their grandkids. Connor, who he is today, is a lot due to the influence that George had on his dad, who then was a really, really good dad to my husband. And so then I'm looking at my life and how I'm impacted by Grandpa George because of his influence on my father-in-law and then my husband. And I'm looking around at so many people and the generations of people that George impacted because he chose to follow Christ, and he did hard things that he didn't have to do. He didn't have to be a dad to anybody. He didn't help create anybody. That was not something that in his life he, had to do. But he stepped up and just did the hard things. And so many people were changed. So many people followed the Lord. And so many people had healthy relationships with a father figure because George stepped up. And I was just so floored at just how someone like George, who no, nobody knows, regular guy, his family knows, people in the small town know, not famous or anything, lived a simple life up in the UP, just living life normally, was just able to impact generations of people because of the choices he made following the Lord and the love of the Father that he showed them. And so I was texting Annalise, and I was like, I really just think we should do an episode about this idea of legacy, because I was so impacted by Grandpa George and the legacy that he left. How many people his life changed, how many people he impacted because of who he was. And it was just the most beautiful thing. I think funerals are obviously such sad times, really sobering times, but there was such joy in the people that were there, and in him, in his final days. He was like, I'm going to heaven, I'm going to see Jesus. And so there was such joy at the funeral, even amidst the sorrow. I think there's a Toby Keith song, and Grandpa George did not like country music, so he'll have to forgive me for using this reference, but it says, he's talking about a friend that passed, and he says, I'm not crying for you, I'm crying for me. And I think that's what was happening at the funeral. It's like people were sad that he's not part of us anymore, but he's with the Father, he's in heaven with Jesus. I mean, he's having the time of his life. But the impact that he left on people was so strong, and the love that people just had for him was so great. And so he probably wasn't a perfect man. We don't know his life. We know a little bit of his story before he got saved, and I probably know even less as someone who married in. But I was a beneficiary of the impact of his life, of his legacy on this earth. And so I think, thank you, Grandpa George. And just a really, really wonderful guy with a really powerful story.
Yeah, that is really beautiful. And it is hard when we lose people that we're close to, but it is incredible. And we do have, right, that assurance of where they're going, that they're going to heaven. And then we can look back and see, as we're talking about, like the legacy that they have left behind and how that also can impact our lives today. And so when you were sharing about this on the phone, and even while you were talking about it right now, it reminded me a lot of the testimony of my great grandma and how she, decisions that she made. Yeah, so I just want to take some time and actually read through my great grandma's testimony. And so it's kind of cool how this all happened. My mom was in Florida, where my grandma lives, and she was going through some of my grandma's things, and she saw this testimony. She found it amongst like all of this stuff. And my great aunt it's my grandma's cousin had heard this testimony. She was at a church service, and my grandma in the 1940s shared this testimony from her life. And then my grandma's cousin went on to write it down. And now we get the blessing of having it and learning this story that my mom didn't know, my grandma didn't know, and it's just really cool. This is from the perspective of my great grandma. I was a very unhappy woman. Some Saturdays when my husband went to town to get the necessary supplies, he would return home intoxicated. I would get very angry with him for the habit, as he wasted our few resources. I was furious with him, and we would quarrel. I spent my time doing housework and taking care of my 3 little children. We didn't visit anyone and had very few friends. I wanted to leave my husband, but my parents would not hear of it. I was also afraid that if I left him, he would commit suicide. I felt my life was unbearable. One day, I decided I would not suffer anymore. His life was more important to his children than mine. I would take my own life. His parents and relatives and mine would help him by taking care of the children. They would be loved, provided for, and well taken care of. I planned that I would accomplish this when he was in town the next Saturday. That week, I worked hard in my garden, cleaning the surrounding areas. On Friday, I washed, mended, and ironed all of the clothes and made sure that all was put away. That Saturday morning, I prepared breakfast for my husband and watched as he saddled his horse. He turned to kiss me goodbye and then mounted. As he started to ride away, my heart seemed to break, and I called out his name. He glanced back at me, and I ran to him. I was going to kiss him for the last time. He gave me a confused look. It was the first time I didn't remind him to return early, not to have too many drinks, and gave him a loving smile and a second kiss at his departure. Do you need me to get you something special? He asked. No, I shook my head. I watched him ride down the dirt road for the last time. It was my desire that when my body was found, everything in my dear little house would be spotless. I had picked out my best nightgown, for I must look as attractive as possible in death. I spent all day dusting, washing the floors, changing beds, and taking care of my children. I didn't allow for the two eldest to take naps so that they would fall asleep early. I tried not to think about anything or anyone but the job at hand. Late in the afternoon, I bathed my children, fed them, and put them to bed. Okay. I covered my husband's meal and set it near to the dying embers of the fire to keep warm. I would accomplish the duty of a good wife, even in my last moments of life. I then bathed, washed, and braided my hair and tied the ends in pink ribbons. I donned my best nightgown and got into bed. No one would have to prepare me for burial. I closed my eyes thinking it was time to do the deed. A glass of water and the poison was sitting on the night table. When I opened my eyes again, to my horror, I saw a spider web on the ceiling rafter in the bedroom. How could I have missed it after cleaning so meticulously? I didn't want anyone to think that I was a careless housekeeper, so I got up and got the broom to pull it down. 2 times I hit it with a broom. On the second time, something fell from the rafters. I bent down to pick it up. It was a small book. The title of it was The New Testament. I opened it and started to read the book of John. The words and the message I had never heard or read before. My father had always read us books and newspapers, but he had never read us anything like this. I was so absorbed with my reading that soon it was dark and I lit the gas lamp and continued reading. What a wonderful book. It was all new to me. I had said the rosary. I prayed to the form on the crucifix above my bed. I knew he was crucified and died for our sins. How come I had never known that what he spoke about? I had never heard much about him. The hours went by, but I could not put the book down. Everything that entered my mind was new, strange, and powerful. The word captivated my heart and mind, and I was unaware that a lot of time had passed when I heard my husband ride in. I rushed outside to see him fall from the horse and make his way to me. What do you have in your hand? He said. It's a book, the New Testament. It dropped down from the rafters. I have been reading it. I helped him in and served him food. My heart was changed. I was horrified of what I had contemplated to do. In spite of his weaknesses for a strong drink, my husband was good, loving, hardworking. I helped him undress and put him in bed. You are a very good wife and mother, Elvie, he muttered before falling asleep. I read the New Testament at every opportunity I could. I read and reread the books, and my life was changed. Never again did I think of suicide. Months later, I met missionaries in town. I committed my life to Jesus. I committed my life to Jesus Christ and to live to please him. My husband is still not a committed believer, but he hardly drinks anymore. I now have peace and joy that is not dependent on circumstances. I have missionaries in town. I committed my life to Jesus. I committed my life to Jesus Christ and to live to please him. My husband is still not a committed believer, but he hardly drinks anymore. I now have peace and joy that is not dependent on circumstances. I have the will to live and enjoy my family, my home. No matter what hardship comes my way, I know Jesus Christ is with me and will come to my aid as he did that day, which I planned was to be the end of my life. Yeah, that is my great grandma's testimony, which is incredible because from that point on, she introduced her children to the faith. And because of that, my grandma was saved. And she then had my mom, and my mom grew up in church. And I will say, it's not that my mom, because she grew up going to church, had this perfect life or that everything was incredible in her family. But I will say that the family line continued to be more healed with each generation, and that it has been a beautiful thing to see how my mom has even changed some of those things for our family. And so continuing to pass on that faith to us, but also that she had such a healthy relationship with us girls, and she nurtured us and loved us in a way that has shaped us in a great extent. And I think because of who my mom is, her legacy will continue to live on in us girls and in our children and in generations to come. And I can even see that in my dad and my grandma on that side as well, that my my dad's dad left him when he was a young boy, and so he grew up in the projects of New York City. So he grew up in poverty, and he grew up with a mother who didn't speak English but is in the United States and figuring out all these things. And he now doesn't have his father who's providing money for them, and so much more than that. But my grandma just always pushed my dad and pushed my aunt to continue to love the Lord, to be involved in church, and then also did not foster bitterness. She fostered an atmosphere of forgiveness for her ex-husband, and pushed her kids to pray for him a lot because he was not living for the Lord. And so again, it's really beautiful that because of how my grandma lived her life, that she changed the trajectory or what could have been for my dad and what could have been for my aunt. And that both my dad and my aunt ended up living really beautiful lives and having long marriages, and having children who love the Lord. And it's because of decisions that my grandma made even in the midst of a lot of hardship. And ultimately, because of the way that she lived and influenced her kids, my dad later in life was actually able to lead his father to the Lord. On my grandpa's deathbed, he's in the hospital, and my dad was able to introduce him to Jesus. And my grandpa said yes, he wanted that. He wanted that relationship with the Lord. And so it's really beautiful to see. I love thinking about my parents' stories, and love thinking about how they changed so much for me and so much in their own lives. And that because of that, I do get the privilege of starting at this place where I have parents who love me, and I have parents who are very stable and who have introduced me to the faith. But they have just left such a legacy, and now they pastor, and seeing it's not just us girls that they've influenced, but the legacy that both of them, but like specifically my dad within his ministry of people who have come to know the Lord, or pastors he's discipled. And yeah, so it's really incredible. And to your point, it's not always like you don't have to be famous to leave a legacy, but it's your family. It's how you influence the people in your immediate circle. It's how you shape the people in your community and in your church, and that has lasting impact because the things that you do then can affect that person, and that person can affect generations to come.
In our culture, we're very individualistic. And so sometimes it's easy to forget that we are a product of our family of origin and their families of origin, and generational sin that can still impact our lives, or our parents or our grandparents. And so we look back at some of these family members, or you see people who made hard decisions that were slowly changing the course for the generations behind them. And today, so many young people, it's really beautiful, are really passionate about changing the world and social justice and justice in itself. And it's so beautiful. But I think sometimes in our digital age, we get caught up that we have to be famous, or in the Christian community, a famous pastor, a famous speaker, or something to make this really huge, impactful change. And then you go to a funeral of someone who is faithful and who just lived their lives serving Christ and doing things even when they were hard in discipline, and just living out a life dedicated to the Lord, even if they weren't perfect, who are the ones that are impacting generations to come in a tangible way. People that have a grand impact, may influence a lot of people, but it's not as great of an influence as the people close to you that were there the whole time. I think it's like a great speaker can preach a great sermon, or maybe a ton of good books. We think of people like Tim Keller or C.S. Lewis, so influential and wonderful and just real heroes in the faith for us, and so many more. But then you think of people who are just really good dads and how much impact they made on the people for generations to come, or really good moms, or really good, neighbors. And I think, yeah, it's at places like these funerals that you realize I don't have to do these huge things. I don't have to go out in some crazy way to change the world. I can change the world by loving the people around me as Christ would love them. And that is what a legacy is, because everyone leaves a legacy. And your legacy isn't going to be your Instagram, and it's not going to be our social media, and it's not going to be, honestly, our college degrees or really our jobs. Our legacy is going to be how we treated the people around us, how we loved our family and our friends, how we faithfully served the Lord. And not that you live your life so that your funeral they say good things about you, or you have a good eulogy, but you live your life wanting to leave a legacy that's what happens. You live your life in a way that's serving other people, and that's what's the most powerful, because a lot of people die and everybody leaves a legacy. Everybody leaves a legacy. We think of legacy as being this big word that only famous people leave or achieve, but everybody leaves a legacy. You have the power every single day to start changing the world by just loving the people around you. And that's what all of our legacy was supposed to be. Jesus is the one that's going to leave the greatest legacy of all time. So we don't have to compete for that. We get to live life freely, knowing that we're going to change the world just by following him, because so many people need him. So many people need us to be showing them his love. And that's what is going to really be the legacy that we want to leave. It just really sobered me. It's like, what am I working towards? What am I shaping my life around? Where do I spend most of my time? How do I treat the people around me? How do I invest in them? How do I invest in my husband? And it really just reorients your priorities. Of course, something like death is going to do that, or, finding your great grandma's powerful testimony is going to do that. But I think Annalise and I really wanted to share these with you so that you can have that reminder. It's really sad that sometimes it takes something as sad as the death of a loved one to remind us what life is really about, because nobody's promised we're not promised tomorrow. We're not promised our next breath. And most of us are living still under the assumption that we're going to live a long time. And a lot of people don't. And so you don't have time to be like, I'm going to work and do whatever I want now. And then in the future, I'm going to change my life to start following the Lord. Or in the future, I'm going to, really press into discipleship with Jesus and be the best Christian I could be later in life and be generous later and be loving later. I'm focused on me now, or I'm young, or I want to spend my money in these places, but we're not guaranteed that. And everything you do leaves an impact somewhere on someone. Annalise and I talk about it all the time, even the things we buy. I mean, that impacts lots of people around the world that we don't think about. So it is just a really, really beautiful but sobering thing that you can leave a powerful legacy just by showing the love of the Lord.
Yeah. And I think that's good what you were saying about how, number one, we don't know how long we're going to be living on this earth. And so I do think sometimes we can think, yeah, I want to leave this legacy, but I have like all this time to do that. And like, oh, I'm gonna be the best mom, or I'm gonna be the best like grandma, blah blah. So I'm gonna pass this stuff on to them. And okay, but do you know that you're gonna make it to that point? Like, do you know that you're actually gonna see those things fulfilled? And no, you don't. And so how do you leave a legacy? Like, if you were to die tomorrow, like, what would the legacy of your life be like? Even at a young age, what would the legacy of your life be like? And one of my friends when I was younger in high school, she passed away, and she was a person who loved everyone. She loved people so deeply. I grew up going to youth group with her, and she would always look for the people who didn't have friends, and that was the person she would be friends with. And she had such a heart for missions, and she just there were so many incredible qualities about her. And she died when she was 17 years old, and still, though, she left a legacy. I know people at her funeral were getting saved and different things like that. And so it's because of the way she lived her life, even in her young years, that when she passed away at a young age, she was still able to leave this legacy behind. And her life impacted so many people, even in those 17 years of life. And so I know in counseling, we'll talk about Erik Erikson's stages of life, or psychosocial development stages. And at the second to last stage is generativity versus stagnation. So this happens when people are 40 to 65 years old. And so generativity is like looking back, right? It's you're wanting to like give back to people behind you, to raise people up, these different kinds of things. And so while it might be most natural that happens when we're later in life, I think that we can constantly be living lives that are like that, constantly living lives that are looking for the people who maybe are younger than us, or who are less fortunate than us, or who are spiritually more immature than us, and looking to see, well, how can I pour into their lives? How can I have effect on their life, ultimately not for our own sake, but ultimately to show them Jesus, right? And so when both of us were talking about like Connor's grandpa, and for myself, my great grandma, it was, yes, decisions that they made and the way that they lived their life, but ultimately their lives pointed to Jesus. It pointed people back to him. And so that's what's most important, because if you're it is really good to help people here on this earth, and we both feel a calling to that, to help people to heal on this earth. But ultimately, what is most important is that people are being brought to Jesus, and that we are we're making him known. As you were saying, like, he has the greatest legacy, and so we are just I guess kind of contributing to that, making that more known to other people, like Jesus's legacy.
Yeah, because It's Jesus who changes these generations. It's your legacy, but it's your legacy because of him. Because Jesus is Redeemer and restorer. Jesus is the one that can help break generational curses and generational trauma and can restore families and can bring divine forgiveness, like your dad with his father. That's the power of Jesus. And so when we're talking about like leaving this legacy, it is only because we have Jesus. George's legacy is George and the decisions that he made, but it's because he accepted Jesus, because that was his joy in life. And he was so full of joy. That's what everyone said about him, that he was so full of joy. He was always cracking jokes. Like I said, it was the most fun funeral I've ever been to because people were just reminiscing about the funniest things he'd say and the jokes that he'd make and just how he was just such a light in that way. And that's what we want to point to. That's what we want our lives to reflect. Because even when we think about it, there's so many people throughout history that we will never know the names of that made huge change. So many people, so many pastors that have given their life to Christ that nobody will ever know. So many missionaries that have done the same thing. So many everyday Christians that have just done amazing work for the Lord, lived out their life, dedicated to him, that we will never know their name till heaven. That's probably like your great grandma, Connor's grandpa George. People that nobody else is going to hear about except the people close to them and their family, that they're people that stand out in the kingdom. That's what Jesus came to do. That's the kind of life change that Jesus came to bring. And they exemplified it. And they weren't famous, but they impacted generations to come. My life being impacted. Someone from New Jersey who just married into the family because of the influence that Grandpa George had on the people that he was around, because of his love and care and devotion and his commitment to the Lord. And so it's really, I don't want to say it's really easy to make changes like this, but honestly, it's not as hard as we think. It's not that we have to live. My friend Jenny was talking to me just yesterday about this and about someone who prophesied over her and said, the Lord said, you're going to live a great life, a really good life. He's got really good plans, really great plans, but they're not grand plans. They're great plans. And that to me was so powerful, that God has the different metrics for what's great than we do. And in our mind, and just the way culture sets things up and kind of how we're wired, is to want someone at the top. And our hearts are created to worship. And so in sin, sometimes we prop other people up in that spot that should be for the Lord, or elevate people with influence or something. But Jesus's idea of who is great is totally different. In the Bible, it says the last will be first and the first will be last. And so I want to encourage you to, if you're listening to this, your life doesn't have to be so crazy. I think what I do, I work in anti-trafficking work, and Annalise has worked in the same field and does counseling. And so I'm sure you've gotten this, Annalise, where people are like, oh, like, that's so amazing. You're such a world changer, things like that. And I don't say that to my own horn or anything, because I don't feel that way about myself at all. I don't even consider those things about myself. But it's only God. It's honestly just me following where God is placing me, that people, are like, wow, that's so amazing. But you following where the Lord is having you go is the same thing. It's just some things look more, outwardly like, oh, that's so, beautiful to dedicate your life to that. But you look at someone like Grandpa George, he didn't go abroad doing anti-trafficking work. He didn't run a whole big ministry. He didn't travel the country and the world speaking and giving these powerful sermons where hundreds of people are getting saved. He was a faithful believer. He was a faithful follower of Jesus, and generations are changed because of him. There are plenty of people. There's lots of people around the world doing that. That is what we are called to. We are called to change the people around us. Sometimes God calls people to have really big influences, but that's not the majority. And so it shouldn't even be our goal. It shouldn't even be our aim. Our aim should just be, God, I want to live this great life that you've planned for me. I want this good life. I don't want that grand life. I don't want what I think is grand. I want what you think is great, because that is what is going to have the biggest impact. That is what is going to be my legacy. And so, yeah, really just beautiful to think about. It's kind of just a little bit countercultural in how we reframe what is actually great. But I think it realigns us with what the word says is actually great, is to be humble and to be kind and to be selfless and to give of ourselves and to be disciplined. And those are what the word considers great. That's what Jesus considers great. And so anyone can live a great life. Anyone can live a legacy like Grandpa George. It's not about having an easy life. It's just that Jesus can come in and change anything. He can come in and redeem anything. And your life can still have a huge impact because of him. It doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what you think you possess, who you were born to, your family of origin, your status in how much money you make. Those things don't matter. Your job doesn't matter. You allowing the Lord to work in your life, change you, and help you love people around you, that is what matters. So that is just what we want to leave you with, an encouragement and just an ode to people that Annalise and I know, and we know so many others in our life, family members and friends that have embodied the same thing. But we wanted to just share impactful stories of two really powerful testimonies that we know of. An ode to Grandpa George, who went to be with the Father, and just reminiscing on his life and just thanking the Lord that he was an influence on people I love so much, and that we got to know him, that I got to know him, and that I got to be a recipient of his legacy. And so let that encourage you. Let that also just let you think about the people in your life and that have impacted you, those that have made changes that might not have been perfect, but have made changes so that you could be where you are today, so that you can know the faith, or changes that you're making so your kids know different, so that the people around you know different. So all of that's possible with Jesus. He can do anything. He can change anything. And so we are so thankful you joined us today. We hope that these stories encourage you, and we will see you next week.